Senator Gerba. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dear colleagues, I rise today speaking from the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. This territorial recognition is very important in the context of this bill. It is vital to remember time and time again that Indigenous peoples have been present on Canada's territory since time immemorial. Last June, I had the honor of introducing my first bill, S-286, an act respecting National Immigration Month. It is therefore with great emotion that I speak to you today about this initiative. It refers to my own life journey, that of many of you here in this illustrious chamber, and that of millions of our compatriots who have come from all over the world to enrich our country with their experience and to contribute to our history. Let me begin with an anecdote, a little scene I witnessed at a gala evening in Montreal. It is the genesis of the bill I'm going to tell you about today. My husband and I had struck up a conversation with a guest during a networking cocktail party that preceded a fundraising gala. Apparently surprised to hear my husband speak excellent French, the woman asked him where he was from. Mischievously, my husband pretended not to understand the meaning of the question and replied, with a smile in his voice, that he was from Laval. To the puzzled look of the woman, who didn't seem satisfied with his answer, he finally revealed his Cameroonian origins. He asked the same question in return, and quite confused, the woman asked him what he meant. My husband gently reminded her that as far as he knew, apart from the Indigenous peoples, all Canadians come from somewhere else. He suggested that she ask her parents and grandparents where her ancestors, came from. Pardon me. This scenario and this question are very frequent and very revealing. They prompted me to formulate the reminder of our common situation, people coming from elsewhere, and to do so by means of a bill. With 3 sections, the text of this bill is very simple, as is its purpose. The aim is to dedicate a month every year to celebrating the essential role that immigration has played in building our country. Canada has been shaped by its immigrants. They built the country we cherish today. They built our country, which is admired around the world. Whatever their chosen field, it is clear that immigrants have played a decisive role in the achievements that are our pride. I will give 5 examples of these immigrants and proud Canadians who helped to write our country's recent history and of whom we're very proud. Jean Augustine. Originally from Grenada, she was the first Black woman elected to the Canadian Parliament and the first Black Canadian woman to hold the position of Federal Minister of the Crown. She played a crucial role in the official recognition of Black History Month in Canada. Denis Laferrière, a Haitian-born writer and academic, his works have enriched Quebec and Canadian literature. He's a member of the Académie Française, which contributes to Canada's cultural influence. Dr. Abdoulaye Baniré Diallo, born in Senegal, is a renowned professor of bioinformatics and artificial intelligence at the Université du Québec à Montréal, UQAM. He was the 2018 Next Einstein Forum laureate. Dr. Diallo is also involved in the development of national research and innovation policy. Gerhard Herzberg was, according to the National Research Council of Canada, one of the country's greatest scientific minds. Born in Germany, he and his wife fled persecution in Nazi Germany and arrived in Canada in 1935. In 1971, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his contribution to knowledge of the electronic structure and geometry of molecules. Originally from Greece, Mike Lazaridis moved to Canada from Turkey. He left his mark on the communications sector with his famous invention, the BlackBerry, that mobile phone that became world famous in the 2000s. These contributions, dear colleagues, must be fully recognized and celebrated, and justice must be done to the people who made these contributions. I sincerely believe that this is a direct and an effective way of encouraging the integration and retention of new generations of immigrants. Before going into detail about why I'm proposing that Canada have a National Immigration Month, I'd like to start by setting the record straight. It will not have escaped your attention that our migration policy is the subject of numerous debates that are in the news on an almost daily basis. Some of these debates are useful and even necessary. Others come dangerously close to theories of rejection and exclusion that have no place in our country. As a proud Quebecer and Canadian of immigrant descent, I can't hide the fact that I feel challenged and very concerned by the current xenophobic extremist rhetoric, which approaches a total rejection of all forms of immigration. Hardliners are dangerously insinuating that immigrants are largely responsible for our country's economic and social problems. I would like to remind you that our country was built by successive waves of immigrants. immigration is still essential today to meet the demographic and economic challenges we face. Canada's aging population and growing need for skilled labor make immigration more necessary than ever. However, integrating these new arrivals must be an absolute priority. This requires efforts on the part of both the new arrivals and the host society. New arrivals need to be helped to adapt to their new environment, learn the local language and customs, while at the same time retaining their identity. This process takes time, but it is achievable and beneficial for everyone. It is also imperative dear colleagues, pardon me. It is also imperative, dear colleagues, to warn against xenophobic policies that seek to divide. Canada must remain an example of tolerance and inclusion. By welcoming immigrants and facilitating their integration, we strengthen our society and ensure a prosperous future for all. But we must also invest to better welcome and retain our new arrivals and to ensure their economic prosperity. We must also invest in securing our borders and severely punish those involved in immigrant smuggling. Ladies and gentlemen, immigration is not our problem, as some people sadly repeat. On the contrary, it is our history, past and present, and our means of leverage for the future.
The
purpose of my bill is not to call for more or for fewer immigrants to Canada or to take sides on this or that aspect of immigration policy. It's on a completely different level and is in line with the times. This project, or rather this bill, refers to successive generations of immigrants to our country who contributed to its development in the areas I've already mentioned. These generations developed our society as a multicultural one in the world's image. The main aim of this bill is therefore to remind all Canadians that we almost all came from somewhere else at different eras. I'm not a historian, but, dear colleagues, here and now, I will talk about different waves of migration to our country. First of all, it's essential to recognize that Canada was not virgin, uninhabited land when Europeans first came here. That was over 5 centuries ago. The word discovery was wrongly used to describe this arrival. Indeed, speaking of discoveries, there's some nuance here. There's a nuance to be added. According to a study published in 2021 in the scientific journal Nature, it was proven that Vikings were present in Newfoundland as early as 1021. It's known that Indigenous people, estimated to be between 350,000 and 500,000 in terms of population, although some figures place it as high as 2 million, were in contact with Vikings at that time. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, the majority considers the arrival of the first waves of immigration from Northeast Asia to be between 30,000 and 13,500 years before our Common Era. In 1604, French explorers Pierre de Monts and Samuel de Champlain founded the first European settlements. In 1608, Champlain founded the city of Quebec. Subsequently, French settlers gradually populated what was then known as New France. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, between 1535 and 1763, about 10,000 French people, including 2,000 women, settled in New France. In 1763, when Great Britain took control of the region, the population had reached 70,000. It would later be supplemented by the arrival of large numbers of Americans loyal to the British Crown. During the 19th century, large numbers of immigrants came to Canada, especially from Europe. The majority were Irish. Their arrival is considered to be the first major wave of immigration after the French and Americans. Then, at the time of Confederation in 1867, Canada's population reached 3.6 million. 1 million of them were descendants of French immigrants, and 2.1 million were descendants of American loyalists, as well as British and Irish immigrants. The need to occupy land, especially in the West, and the relative low numbers of its population led Canada to see immigration as an essential driver for the country's development. However, it was very selective immigration, which excluded Asians and Black people. It was not until the Second World War that discriminatory and restrictive laws were gradually replaced by laws that were general in application. This large-scale migration created strong tensions with Indigenous peoples, including the Métis and First Nations, who were forcibly removed from their lands. This crisis culminated in the 1885 Northwest Rebellion. During this time, according to the Discover Canada Guide, approximately 1 million British and 1 million Americans immigrated to Canada. This was followed by the arrival of an increasingly diverse range of immigrants in order to meet the country's development challenges. Working in strategic sectors such as industry, mining, or construction, these immigrants were the architects of the new country of Canada. All throughout the 20th century, immigration to Canada continued, especially in the West. These immigrants helped make the prairies the powerful agricultural region that it is still today. At the end of the Second World War, this country became attractive to Southern Europeans who were going through very hard times. They built the cores of some of our main cities. Canada gradually became a welcoming country and put an end to its discriminatory laws and regulations, and successively received asylum seekers fleeing pariah states and those displaced by war. Many of them come from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. This sudden influx forced Canada to innovate regarding its immigration policy. As a result, The first Canadian private sponsorship of refugees program was set up. More than 50% of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian refugees were welcomed this way by Canada. In the early 1960s, according to the Discover Canada Guide, approximately one-third of Canadians were of non-British or non-French origin. Successive waves of immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries gradually contributed to the rise of a multicultural society in our country. Our country has the highest proportion of immigrants among G7 countries. According to Statistics Canada, in 2021, more than 8.3 million people, nearly one quarter or 23% of the population, were or had been landed immigrants or permanent residents in Canada. The organization points out that this is, and I quote, the highest proportion since the creation of Confederation, surpassing the previous peak reached in 1921, which was 22.3%, end quote. What's more, given that Canada's population is gradually aging and its birth rate remains below the rate for population renewal, immigration is now the country's main demographic driver. By 2041, according to Statistics Canada projections, immigrants could account for 29.1% to 34% of Canada's population. Colleagues, this brief overview of the history of Canada's population was intended to show you one thing. At different times, every single one of us came from elsewhere, apart from Indigenous peoples. Whether it was 1,000 years ago, 5 centuries ago, 4 generations ago, 3 decades ago, a month ago, or a week ago, we all came from somewhere else. However, we must never forget that the process of populating the country and occupying this territory often led to the dispossession of cultures, languages, traditions, and lands among Indigenous peoples. Our country is the fruit of the hopes and dreams of millions of immigrants who came from the 4 corners of the world to build a better life. Unfortunately for Indigenous peoples, it was a tragic erasure of their rights and their tangible assets and their intangible assets. These two realities are two sides of the same coin. They make up our history. They create a demand for justice, for reparation, for compensation, and a duty to remember that we must share with future generations. There's another reason behind this bill, dear colleagues. It's about the multiplication of motions and legislation concerning the celebration of the heritage of this or the community of that living in Canada. Of course, the aim behind those various initiatives is legitimate and stems from the same observation I made, which is the need to highlight the invaluable contributions of immigrants to our country. I see National Immigration Month as a useful wake-up call, especially at a time when some people have no hesitation blaming immigrants for certain complex and difficult social situations. It could act as a showcase. It could be an opportunity for all our immigrant groups to highlight the contributions of their communities. By bringing together various celebrations, this National Month, far from diluting the other celebrations, would act as a forum for them in order to highlight the rich contributions of all immigrants, regardless of the size and importance of their community. I was able to gauge the extent to which introducing a National Immigration Month would be supported by many groups. I presented this bill to them. On May 15th, my team and I organized a roundtable to consult organizations representing immigrants' interests. We contacted and brought together about 30 organizations. We invited them to give their opinion on the initiative I'm putting forward now. During those very productive sessions, we received feedback from stakeholders across the country, representing the largest immigrant communities. The message we received was clear. Every stakeholder confirmed their support for a bill instituting National Immigration Month. Of course, the consultation was not intended to be exhaustive. However, it did have the merit of facilitating a serious discussion about the reception relevant organizations would give to this bill. We also continued our consultations, this time over the phone, over the summer. I asked the people I spoke with about the month that should be chosen to bring this initiative to fruition, and a certain consensus emerged around the month of November. The choice of this month is relevant in several respects. First of all, November is already the time for Francophone Immigration Week. According to the organizer's website, it brings together thousands of Francophones from across the country to celebrate the richness of cultural diversity and the contribution of immigrants to Francophone and Acadian communities. Second, the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which establishes fundamental concepts and principles regarding immigration and refugee protection, was assented to on November 1st, 2001. I want to reiterate the central importance of this legislation, which provides a framework for Canada's modern immigration policy. I'd like to take you through how this legislation is a milestone and demonstrate why it is so important. The migration policy we have today, the one that we know today, is based on objective and universal principles. However, that was not always part of Canadian standards. For a long period of our history, Canadian migration policy focused on white immigration, preferably from the British Empire, from Central Europe, and from the United States. However, in response,
Toutefois, en réponse à la demande...
However, in response to the demand for labor, the government drew up a list of ideal settlers in descending order of preference, and I quote,
Je cite ici textuellement
I'm quoting the Canadian Encyclopedia verbatim. British and American farmers, followed by the French, Belgians, Dutch, Scandinavians, Swiss, Finns, Russians, Austro-Hungarians, Germans, Ukrainians, and Poles. Close to the bottom of the list are those who, in the minds of the public and the government are less easy to assimilate and less desirable. Italians, South Slavs, Greeks, and Syrians. Last on the list are Jews, Asians, Gypsies, and blacks. End of quote. As you can see, dear colleagues, it's an understatement to say that immigration criteria at the time were discriminatory. What's more, non-white would-be immigrants are refused entry to the country on racist grounds. In 1911, Canada almost completely banned the immigration of black people, and they were not the only ones affected. As early as 1885, Chinese immigrants had to pay a special tax. In 1923, they were virtually refused entry to Canada. Immigration from Japan and from India was also very restricted. In 1919, through the Revised Immigration Act, the government banned certain groups, such as communists, Mennonites, and Doukhobors, from entering Canada. People from countries that fought against Canada in the First World War, such as Austrians, Hungarians, and Turks, suffered the same fate. Religious grounds were used to exclude specific groups of people. In 1939, Jewish refugees fleeing aboard the liner MS St. Louis were fleeing Nazi Germany, and they were refused entry to Canada. The formal ban on Chinese immigration was lifted in 1947. On June 22, 2006, Prime Minister Stephen Harper officially apologized for the head tax from 1885 to 1923 and the exclusion policy in place from 1923 to 1947. Canadian immigration policy was modernized in 1967 with the adoption of a points system to classify immigrants according to admissibility. Skin color and nationality were no longer used as criteria for selecting immigrants. We now place the emphasis on language skills, English or French, level of education, professional skills, and family ties. This paved the way for the immigration system we know today. Although Canada is a signatory to the 1951 United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees and its 1967 protocol, there would be no program governing applications for refugee status. Each application is still considered on a case-by-case basis. The 1976 Immigration Act represented a radical change. For the very first time, it set out clearly defined objectives for Canadian migration policy and its priorities, such as family reunification, diversity, and non-discrimination. Refugees are now protected as a distinct group of immigrants in Canadian law. This requires the government to meet its obligations under international agreements. In 1979, the famous private sponsorship program was launched, the only one of its kind. It enabled over 327,000 refugees to be accepted in Canada over its 40 years of existence. There's room for improvement, but it remains one of the great success stories of Canadian migration policy. In 1980, 5 categories were created for entry to Canada: independent, people making their own application; humanitarian, refugees and other persecuted or displaced people; family, meaning immediate family already living in Canada; Assisted relatives, meaning distant relatives sponsored by a family member in Canada, and economic, meaning people with highly sought-after professional skills, or those prepared to open a business or to invest significantly in the Canadian economy. On November 1st, 2001, the 1976 Immigration Act was replaced by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. The new law maintains a substantial part of the principles and policies of the previous version of the law, specifically regarding different categories of immigrants. However, it also extends the family category to include same-sex couples and common law relationships. The law is the cornerstone of Canada's migration policy. The Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, passed on November 1st, 2001, is an argument in favor of National Immigration Month, which could be held in November each year. I would also add that this month is a good one for organizing parliamentary activities, as it most often lines up with times when the House of Commons and the Senate are in session. In addition, apart from Remembrance Day, Parliament's calendar of events is relatively light that month, allowing other national celebrations to be held. National Immigration Month would undoubtedly be an opportunity to highlight the contributions of our immigrant communities. The federal government has an important role to play in those celebrations, especially Heritage Canada, Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada, and, of course, our Parliament. We must give a place and give visibility to our immigrant communities. Their involvement in our communities deserves to be better known, better recognized. I'd like to give you a little idea about my own immigrant background if I have the time. I was born in Bafia, a small village in Cameroon, the 18th of 19 children, 6 of them girls. I'm the only girl who had the chance to go to school, and I'm the only one who immigrated to Canada in 1986, thanks to my husband, a grant recipient from the now defunct Canadian International Development Agency. My husband was due to return to Cameroon after obtaining his doctorate in communications to teach at the École supérieure internationale de journalisme. But after he got his degree, we decided to stay in Canada to provide better living conditions for our 4 children, 3 of whom were born here in Canada. Today, through my family's various entrepreneurial initiatives, I can say that I'm very proud, and I can say that we are all contributing to the prosperity of our country. Dear colleagues, as you can see from my story, Canada is fundamentally a land of immigration. It shaped the country we know today. This reality has, in fact, been hailed in a nonpartisan way over the last few decades by many prime ministers of various political stripes. The Right Honourable Stephen Harper said in an article in the Globe and Mail in 2012, and I quote, "This government believes
Immigration benefits from immigration, and that those needs and benefits will become even greater in the future if this is done correctly." Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Colleagues, recognizing a month dedicated to immigration will send a powerful message to all Canadians and to international community. Though this bill we intend to recognize the builder of our country, celebrate our common heritage, and continue to show our commitment to the values of inclusion, diversity, and mutual respect. Immigrants are the past, the present, and the future of Canada. Les immigrants sont le passé, le présent et l'avenir du Canada.
Immigrants are the past, the present, and the future of Canada. That's why I urge you, honorable senators, to vote without delay in favor of Bill C-286 in order to establish November as National Immigration Month in Canada. To this end, I sincerely believe your contributions to this debate will be very valuable, especially should they answer the following questions. What is your personal immigration history? What are your origins? How did your community help build the Canada that we know today? What can we do to improve the way we live together and change the way we look at immigration? Thank you for your kind attention.